The mathematics of the battlefield begin to collapse against the defender once swarm density reaches a certain threshold. A tank crew can track one incoming threat. In some cases, it can survive two or three, but dozens of autonomous loitering systems operating simultaneously across overlapping attack vectors create a saturation environment where reaction time becomes meaningless. Every defensive layer begins interfering with every other defensive layer. Radar clutter increases, identification timelines compress, ammunition for active protection systems depletes, electronic warfare systems struggle to prioritize targets, and all of this unfolds while small autonomous weapons continue circling overhead waiting for the exact moment a hatch opens, an engine signature appears, or a vehicle attempts to reposition. This is the real significance of what Iran demonstrated. Not simply the destruction of armored vehicles, but the industrialization of affordable precision kill capability. For decades, advanced militaries assumed that destroying heavily armored formations at scale required either air supremacy, concentrated artillery, or large mechanized engagements involving comparable armored forces. That assumption no longer holds. A relatively inexpensive swarm of autonomous loitering munitions can now threaten assets that cost millions of dollars each and require years to build, maintain, and crew. And the economic asymmetry here is staggering. A Merkava 4 costs roughly $8 million before accounting for crew training, maintenance infrastructure, logistics support, and operational sustainment. A modified loitering munition capable of conducting a top attack strike may cost tens of thousands of dollars, perhaps less depending on production scale and component sourcing. This means the attacker is imposing catastrophic losses using systems that are orders of magnitude cheaper than the assets being destroyed. That is not merely a tactical shift, it is a transformation in the economics of warfare itself. What we are witnessing resembles earlier military revolutions where established doctrines suddenly encountered technologies they were never designed to survive against. Battleships confronted carrier aviation. Fortified trench systems encountered mechanized maneuver warfare. Traditional air defenses confronted stealth aircraft and cruise missiles. In every case, the institution built around the older model initially struggled to comprehend how quickly the balance had shifted. Armies do not abandon doctrine easily because doctrine is tied to procurement, training, prestige, and institutional identity. The main battle tank has been central to modern land warfare for generations. Entire military cultures were built around the assumption that armored maneuver remained the decisive instrument of battlefield dominance. But modern battlefields are becoming radically transparent. Drones, thermal sensors, synthetic aperture radar, persistent satellite surveillance, electronic signature tracking, and AI-assisted target recognition are reducing the survivability of large mechanized formations. Tanks were historically dangerous because finding and targeting them reliably under combat conditions was difficult. That concealment advantage is eroding rapidly. Once a platform becomes continuously detectable, survivability increasingly depends not on armor thickness alone, but on mobility, deception, electronic warfare integration, and layered counter-drone defense, and even those defenses face brutal scaling problems. It is one thing to intercept a handful of incoming drones. It is another to sustain continuous defense against hundreds or thousands of autonomous systems operating across multiple altitudes and attack profiles. The defender faces an exhaustion problem long before the attacker does. Missiles, interceptors, and advanced defensive systems are expensive. Swarm drones are comparatively cheap and increasingly mass-producible. Over time, the side able to manufacture autonomous precision systems at industrial scale acquires a structural advantage. This is why militaries around the world are studying these developments with enormous urgency. The implications extend far beyond one conflict. NATO planners are studying the vulnerability of armored brigades deployed in Eastern Europe. China is studying the implications for Taiwan contingency planning. India and Pakistan are examining how drone saturation changes border warfare. Even smaller states are recognizing that autonomous precision strike systems provide forms of deterrence once available only to major military powers. The psychological effect may be just as important as the physical destruction itself. Armored crews historically relied on the belief that their vehicles could survive most battlefield threats if employed correctly. That confidence matters operationally because offensive maneuver warfare depends heavily on aggression, tempo, and initiative. Once crews begin believing their platforms can be destroyed from above at any moment by invisible autonomous systems they cannot reliably detect or stop, battlefield behavior changes. Movement slows, concentration becomes dangerous, defensive caution replaces offensive momentum, and if that psychological shift spreads broadly enough, it forces militaries to redesign the entire architecture of ground combat operations. Future armored formations may require permanent overhead drone screens, integrated laser defense systems, electronic warfare bubbles, autonomous counter-drone escorts, and far greater operational dispersion. Large, concentrated armored thrusts, once the defining image of mechanized warfare, may become increasingly rare because they present too lucrative a target environment for autonomous swarm attacks. The deeper issue is that military technology is now evolving faster than doctrine can adapt. Procurement cycles for major armored platforms take decades. Bureaucratic institutions move slowly, but software-guided autonomous weapons evolve in cycles measured in months or even weeks. Artificial intelligence-assisted targeting systems improve continuously through battlefield data. Manufacturing processes become cheaper and more distributed. The side adapting faster gains disproportionate advantages. That does not mean tanks disappear entirely. History rarely works in absolutes. Every supposedly obsolete platform tends to survive in modified form once countermeasures emerge. Tanks still provide mobility, firepower, and protected maneuver capability that lighter systems cannot fully replace, but their role is likely changing fundamentally. Instead of being the undisputed centerpiece of ground warfare, they may become one component within a much larger network battlefield ecosystem dominated increasingly by autonomous systems, electronic warfare, and distributed precision strike capability. And that is why this moment matters beyond the immediate conflict itself. Militaries everywhere are watching a possible preview of how future wars may actually be fought: swarms over formations, algorithms over mass, persistence over concentration, and affordable autonomous precision weapons imposing unsustainable costs on even the most sophisticated conventional armored forces in the world. There is a moment in every major geopolitical confrontation when the official narrative being presented to the public begins to diverge completely from the structural reality unfolding underneath it. I believe we are now living through one of those moments. The headlines focus on missiles, retaliation cycles, emergency summits, ceasefire proposals, and dramatic statements delivered behind podiums draped with national flags. But beneath all of that theater, something far more consequential is taking shape. The balance between industrial military power and low-cost precision warfare is changing faster than most governments are willing to publicly admit, and the implications of that shift reach far beyond one battlefield, one country, or one regional conflict. What we are witnessing is the gradual erosion of assumptions that have defined modern military doctrine for more than half a century. For decades, armored superiority was treated as the foundation of battlefield dominance. The logic appeared straightforward. A state that possessed heavily protected tanks, advanced targeting systems, superior logistics, and highly trained crews could impose its will on the battlefield through maneuver, shock, and sustained firepower. Entire military institutions were organized around that premise. Billions upon billions of dollars were invested into platforms designed to survive direct confrontation and deliver overwhelming offensive capability. But military systems do not become vulnerable because they are poorly engineered. They become vulnerable because technology changes the relationship between cost, survivability, and lethality. That is the part of the conversation that is often ignored. History is filled with examples of dominant military systems suddenly becoming economically or tactically unsustainable once a cheaper and more scalable countermeasure emerges. The heavily armored knight disappeared not because armor stopped working entirely, but because mass projectile weapons changed the economics of warfare. Battleships lost their strategic supremacy not because they ceased to be powerful, but because aircraft and submarines altered the vulnerability equation. Fixed fortifications became liabilities once long-range artillery and air power matured. Every military era eventually collides with a technological disruption that transforms what had previously appeared untouchable into something dangerously exposed. That is why the emergence of large-scale autonomous precision strike systems matters so much. A modern main battle tank represents an extraordinary concentration of resources. The vehicle itself is expensive, the training pipeline for its crew is expensive, the logistics network required to maintain it is expensive, the fuel consumption, spare parts, electronic systems, ammunition supply chains, and maintenance infrastructure create a massive operational ecosystem that must function continuously for armored warfare to remain effective. Now compare that to the production profile of modern loitering munitions. Small autonomous strike drones can be manufactured in huge numbers using relatively inexpensive materials and commercially adaptable electronics. They do not require elite crews. They do not require years of training investment. They do not require the same level of industrial sophistication needed to produce advanced armored vehicles. Most importantly, they are designed around a completely different philosophy of warfare. Traditional armored doctrine assumes that survivability is achieved through layered protection, maneuverability, and fire superiority. Autonomous strike systems operate on a different assumption entirely. They assume that saturation eventually overwhelms defense. This distinction is critical. A tank may successfully survive one incoming anti-armor missile. It may survive two. Advanced active protection systems can intercept certain categories of threats approaching from predictable vectors, but the defensive equation changes dramatically once dozens of autonomous systems are simultaneously searching for targets across the same operational zone. The problem becomes mathematical before it becomes tactical. No defense system possesses infinite engagement capacity. Radar tracking, ammunition reserves, interception timing, sensor coverage, and reaction speed all have limits. Once enough low-cost precision systems are introduced into the battle space simultaneously, even highly sophisticated defensive networks begin to experience saturation failure. And saturation failure creates a psychological effect as important as the physical destruction itself. Military doctrine depends on confidence. Tank crews must believe their vehicle can survive. Commanders must believe armored formations can maneuver effectively. Political leadership must believe battlefield losses remain manageable within acceptable operational parameters. Once those assumptions begin to collapse, doctrine itself becomes unstable. That is what makes this technological transition so strategically significant. The issue is not whether tanks suddenly become useless everywhere under all conditions. That would be an oversimplification. Heavy armor still retains enormous value in certain operational environments. The issue is that the cost-benefit relationship underpinning armored warfare is shifting toward the attacker at a speed institutions were not prepared for, and institutions are always slower than technological disruption. Large military organizations are built around procurement cycles measured in decades. Weapons platforms are designed, tested, approved, funded, manufactured, and deployed over extremely long timelines. Entire officer careers are shaped around mastering those systems. Defense industries become economically dependent on them. Political prestige becomes attached to them. But autonomous strike technologies evolve on timelines measured in months rather than decades. That mismatch matters enormously. A low-cost drone manufacturer can adapt targeting software, guidance systems, navigation profiles, or attack methods extremely quickly. Production can be decentralized. Components can be substituted. Lessons from battlefield performance can be incorporated almost immediately into the next production cycle. Meanwhile, the systems attempting to defend against those threats often require years of procurement approvals, industrial coordination, budget allocations, doctrinal review, and retraining before meaningful adaptation occurs. The action-reaction cycle increasingly favors the side capable of scaling cheap offensive systems faster than defensive systems can evolve. And that reality extends far beyond one regional military balance. Every major military power is watching these developments carefully. American planners are watching. Chinese planners are watching. Russian planners are watching. NATO planners are watching because the implications are not regional, they are systemic. For decades, Western military power has relied heavily on the assumption that superior platforms combined with superior training could offset numerical disadvantages. That assumption worked extraordinarily well during the late 20th century and early 21st century. Precision-guided munitions, stealth aircraft, advanced armored systems, satellite integration, and network-centric warfare created enormous battlefield asymmetries. But asymmetric systems evolve. Adversaries study vulnerabilities. They identify weak points that cannot be economically defended at scale. They search for methods that force expensive systems into unfavorable exchange ratios. This is one of the oldest principles in military history. The side that imposes unsustainable costs on its opponent often gains strategic leverage even without matching overall military power directly. That is precisely why low-cost autonomous strike systems are attracting so much attention from states operating under resource constraints. They provide a pathway for weaker powers to challenge technologically superior opponents without replicating their entire military structure. Instead of attempting to build better tanks, better aircraft carriers, or larger air forces, they focus on systems capable of degrading the effectiveness of those assets at dramatically lower cost. It is not parity through imitation, it is parity through disruption. And disruption changes strategic calculations. Consider the economic dimension alone. If a precision strike drone costing tens of thousands of dollars can reliably destroy or disable equipment valued in the millions, the sustainability equation becomes deeply uncomfortable for the defender. It means industrial replacement capacity suddenly matters more than battlefield prestige. It means manufacturing scalability becomes as important as technological sophistication. Wars are not sustained purely through tactical victories. They are sustained through production, logistics, economics, and political endurance. This is why analysts increasingly focus not only on battlefield performance, but on industrial resilience. Which states can manufacture replacement systems fastest? Which states possess decentralized production capacity? Which states can absorb losses more sustainably over time? Which economies can endure prolonged attritional competition? Those questions matter because modern warfare is becoming simultaneously more precise and more industrial. Precision does not eliminate attrition, it accelerates it. Another dimension receiving insufficient attention is psychological adaptation. Traditional military training prepares soldiers to confront identifiable threats: artillery, missiles, aircraft, armored vehicles, infantry assaults. Autonomous loitering systems create a fundamentally different psychological environment because the threat becomes persistent, difficult to predict, and omnidirectional. A tank crew can orient toward a known front line. It cannot easily orient toward dozens of small autonomous systems potentially approaching from any direction at any moment. The battlefield becomes vertically dangerous in a way previous generations of armored doctrine were never fully designed to handle. This alters movement patterns, concealment doctrine, operational tempo, and force concentration principles. Armored formations historically relied on mass and maneuver to achieve breakthrough, but mass increasingly creates vulnerability under persistent aerial surveillance combined with precision strike saturation. Large concentrations of equipment become target-rich environments. As a result, dispersion becomes necessary. But dispersion weakens concentration of force, and weakened concentration alters offensive capability. This is the strategic dilemma emerging across modern military planning. How do heavily mechanized forces maintain offensive momentum in an environment where concentration increases vulnerability while dispersion reduces combat effectiveness? There is no fully mature answer yet. Various militaries are experimenting with layered drone defense systems, mobile electronic warfare, laser interception concepts, automated anti-drone turrets, camouflage adaptations, decoy deployments, and distributed command structures. Some of these measures will likely improve survivability, but adaptation takes time, and time is exactly what rapidly evolving offensive technologies attempt to deny. This is why so many defense establishments appear publicly calm while privately accelerating internal reassessment. Military institutions rarely announce doctrinal crises openly. They study them quietly. They conduct classified war games. They revise procurement assumptions behind closed doors. They test contingency concepts long before public acknowledgement occurs. But the signs of reassessment are already visible. Defense budgets increasingly prioritize autonomous systems. Counter-drone programs are expanding rapidly. Electronic warfare investment is surging. Artificial intelligence integration into battlefield management is accelerating. The future force structure debate inside every major military establishment is intensifying, and beneath all of it lies a deeper question: what happens when technological accessibility democratizes precision warfare? That may ultimately be the most important issue of all. For most of modern history, highly precise military strike capability remained concentrated within major powers possessing advanced industrial bases. But autonomous systems lower barriers to entry dramatically. Smaller states and even non-state actors can increasingly acquire capabilities once reserved for technologically dominant militaries. That diffusion changes global security dynamics. It means deterrence becomes more complicated. It means infrastructure becomes more vulnerable. It means traditional assumptions about escalation control become less reliable. And it means military superiority becomes harder to maintain through hardware dominance alone. The states that adapt fastest to this reality will likely possess enormous strategic advantages in the coming decades. But adaptation is not simply technological, it is institutional. It requires changing procurement culture, operational doctrine, training frameworks, industrial priorities, and strategic assumptions simultaneously. That is extremely difficult for large organizations built around legacy systems and legacy thinking. History shows that military revolutions are rarely recognized immediately by the institutions most threatened by them. There is almost always a transitional period where old doctrines continue operating despite growing evidence that the battlefield environment has fundamentally changed. We may now be entering such a period, and if we are, then the consequences will extend far beyond one conflict, one army, or one region. They will reshape how states calculate power itself, because power in the 21st century may belong less to the side with the most expensive platforms and more to the side capable of adapting faster, producing cheaper, scaling wider, and absorbing disruption more effectively. That is the real strategic conversation unfolding beneath the headlines right now. Not simply who won one exchange, not simply whose narrative dominates social media, but whether the underlying economics and physics of modern warfare are changing in ways that permanently alter the balance between offensive and defensive power. And if that balance truly is shifting, then every military institution on Earth is now operating inside the early stages of a transformation far larger than most publics yet understand. The deeper implication of this shift is not simply tactical, it is civilizational in the way it alters how states think about power itself. For more than a century, industrial military dominance has been measured through concentration of capability, larger fleets, heavier armor, more advanced aircraft, bigger logistical systems. Military prestige became tied to the visible scale of force projection and the ability to sustain massive mechanized formations across multiple theaters simultaneously. But technological disruption rarely destroys an older system immediately. What it does first is change the economics surrounding that system. And once the economics change, doctrine eventually follows. This is why the emerging era of autonomous precision warfare matters so profoundly. It introduces a battlefield environment where concentration increasingly creates exposure instead of security. The larger and more expensive a platform becomes, the more pressure there is on an adversary to design cheap systems capable of neutralizing it efficiently. That pressure drives innovation toward asymmetry. When a state cannot compete symmetrically against a technologically superior military, it searches for ways to exploit the cost structure supporting that military. Instead of building equivalent armored formations, equivalent carrier fleets, or equivalent air forces, it develops systems designed specifically to undermine the operational assumptions that make those formations effective in the first place. That is the essence of modern asymmetric doctrine. Not defeating strength through direct confrontation, but converting strength into a logistical and economic burden that becomes progressively harder to sustain. This principle has appeared repeatedly throughout military history. Guerrilla warfare challenged colonial armies not because insurgents possessed superior equipment, but because they altered the relationship between cost and control. Submarines threatened dominant naval powers by attacking maritime trade at far lower cost than battleship construction. Improvised explosive devices disrupted advanced mechanized armies by exploiting vulnerabilities embedded within road-bound logistics systems. Each technological shift forced military institutions to confront the same uncomfortable reality. Superiority in one era does not guarantee survivability in the next. What makes autonomous strike systems uniquely disruptive is that they compress several revolutions into one. They are cheap enough to mass produce, precise enough to threaten high-value targets, distributed enough to survive attrition, adaptive enough to evolve rapidly, and scalable enough to saturate defenses designed around lower-density threat environments. That combination changes military planning fundamentally. A traditional armored force depends on survivability through layered defense, armor protection, maneuver, active protection systems, air defense coverage, concealment, and battlefield integration. But saturation warfare erodes the effectiveness of layered defense because every defensive system eventually reaches engagement limits. A radar can only track so many targets simultaneously. An interceptor system carries finite ammunition. A crew can process only limited streams of information under stress. An active protection system has engagement timing constraints. And once enough autonomous systems are introduced into the operational environment at once, the defensive architecture itself begins to fracture under cumulative pressure. This is why the future battlefield increasingly appears less like the concentrated industrial warfare of the 20th century and more like a contest between adaptive networks competing for decision-making speed, manufacturing scalability, and operational flexibility. The implications extend far beyond armored doctrine alone. Air bases become more vulnerable, naval assets become more vulnerable, supply depots become more vulnerable, critical infrastructure becomes more vulnerable. Any system dependent on concentrated high-value assets becomes increasingly exposed to large-scale precision harassment by low-cost autonomous platforms, and that exposure introduces a dangerous strategic dilemma for advanced militaries. Do they continue investing heavily in exquisite platforms whose survivability is becoming progressively more uncertain, or do they transition toward more distributed force structures that sacrifice some traditional dominance in exchange for resilience? That debate is already unfolding internally across major military institutions, even if public messaging remains cautious. The United States is expanding autonomous systems procurement rapidly. China is integrating drone swarm doctrine deeply into future operational planning. Russia has accelerated loitering munition production after observing battlefield performance in Ukraine. European NATO states are reassessing assumptions surrounding mechanized warfare that had remained largely unchanged since the Cold War. Because beneath all the rhetoric and official confidence, defense planners understand something important. The action-reaction cycle now favors adaptation speed over static superiority. In previous eras, dominant powers could maintain military advantage for decades because technological diffusion occurred relatively slowly. Today, battlefield innovation spreads globally almost in real time. Tactical lessons observed in one conflict are studied, copied, modified, and integrated elsewhere with extraordinary speed. A successful drone tactic demonstrated in one theater may influence procurement decisions across half the world within months. That acceleration compresses strategic timelines dramatically. And it creates instability because institutions built around long procurement cycles struggle to adapt at the pace modern conflict increasingly demands. There is also a psychological dimension to this transformation that receives far less attention than it deserves. Military systems are built not only on hardware, but on confidence. Crews must trust their platforms. Commanders must trust doctrine. Political leaders must trust the survivability of the forces underpinning national strategy. Once that confidence begins to erode, the consequences spread far beyond the battlefield itself. Procurement priorities change, alliance calculations change, deterrence calculations change, public perceptions of military power change, and adversaries become more willing to challenge systems that previously appeared untouchable. This is often how major military transitions unfold historically, not through one decisive moment, but through accumulating demonstrations that slowly undermine belief in an older model of warfare. At first, institutions dismiss those demonstrations as anomalies. Then they reinterpret them as isolated operational failures. Eventually, however, the pattern becomes too large to ignore. And once that happens, doctrine enters crisis, not because previous systems suddenly become useless overnight, but because the assumptions governing their use no longer align with technological reality. We may now be entering precisely such a period. The future likely does not belong exclusively to tanks or drones, to manned systems or autonomous systems, to armor or precision strike networks. Instead, warfare appears to be moving toward hybridized environments, where survivability depends increasingly on distribution, concealment, electronic warfare integration, autonomous support systems, rapid mobility, and decentralized operational structures. The militaries adapting fastest to those conditions will possess enormous advantages, but adaptation requires something difficult for large institutions: the willingness to acknowledge that previous assumptions may no longer hold. That is never easy, especially for powers whose strategic identity became intertwined with the very systems now being questioned. And that is why this moment matters so much. Because the real story is not simply about one battlefield exchange or one regional confrontation. The real story is that the global military balance may be entering a new technological era in which cheap precision, autonomous scalability, and asymmetric adaptation challenge the dominance of concentrated industrial power in ways that will reshape military planning for decades to come.